Hello, everybody, and welcome to the second episode of Buddhapod. I'm Catherine.
Hello, I'm Andrew, and today we'll be talking about the life of the Buddha.
So I think when a lot of people think about the life of the Buddha, they just kind of think about the part where he meditates for 49 days and he becomes enlightened and he's the Buddha. But actually, he's a human being just like every one of us. And today, I really want to go into, before he became the Buddha, the types of hardships that he endured and the types of decisions that he had to make that made him who he is today. And I think that those of you who are listening, you'll really be able to hear a lot of parallels in your life because it's a story of someone growing up, I would say. So how about, Andrew, you start because we're both really familiar. So let's talk about like the first part of the story.
Sure. So what I wanted to start with is that this is going to be a 2-episode sort of mini-series. Today we'll only get up to the point where the Buddha attains awakening and actually becomes a Buddha. So this is going to cover his childhood as a prince, him renouncing his palace life and becoming a wandering ascetic and begging for food, and then eventually meditating and practicing, and then finding the middle way and becoming a Buddha. And the reason why we wanted to start with the life of the Buddha so early on in the podcast is because Venerable Master Hsing Yun actually in the Biography of Sakyamuni Buddha says that we can have a general understanding of what Buddhism is through the Buddha's words and actions. And I think this is very true. By looking at the life of the Buddha, what he said, what he taught, and what he did, we can understand how the Buddha himself practiced and how we can use that as a model for our own practice.
For sure.
I think we should start with the context in which the Buddha lived. And of course, the Buddha lived in a time much, much earlier than us, 2,600 plus years earlier. But there are a lot of things about his time that still hold true today. And although during the Buddha's time, he lived in ancient India where people were put into, well, they were born into 4 social castes. And so these castes were social positions that people were locked into because of beliefs at the time. And although we live in America in the 21st century in the land of the free, where we are supposed to pursue the American dream, I think this issue of social inequality is very, very much true today. I don't think there's any denying that people who are born into poverty are more or less stuck in that poverty, and those who are born into wealth are generally going to be continuing that wealth. And so even though the social context today is different, it's not too much different. And I think we still hold a lot of similarities. And so we can use that to understand the Buddha's situation.
Right. And so I wanted to start with the childhood of the Buddha because he was born actually into the second social caste level, which is the rulers and the kings. And he was born to become the king someday. And with that comes great responsibility because during his time, he had to study 7 subjects, and he also had to be good at martial arts and archery and things like that. And his dad, King Suddhodana, put a lot of pressure on him to do well because obviously he wants someone great as a leader. But Prince Siddhartha, that's Buddha's name before he renounced. Prince Siddhartha, he didn't crumble under the pressure of having to do well all the time because he understood that, this is his position, this is his role. But like on the other hand, I would see people they don't usually deal with pressure as well as he would have. So I think on the part of the Buddha, he actually accepted this responsibility and, earned his parents' trust. And when when I read this part of his story, it really reminded me of kind of like me as a child of an immigrant. We kind of have to fulfill these expectations that our parents had for us because they made so many sacrifices. I don't know if is that the same case for you, Andrew?
Oh, yeah, it's totally the same case for me. So my parents are also first generation immigrants. They came over here after the Vietnam War and they made a lot of sacrifices along the way. So growing up, I always felt that I had to make all of those sacrifices worth it, and I really had to excel in school, get a good job, and repay them for all of the things that they had sacrificed over the years, and bring us out of poverty and sort of change the family's future and all of that. And so it's a lot of pressure.
Yeah. And I feel like amongst all of that, like I kind of didn't feel like sometimes it would be like, well, this is my life and this isn't their life. Why are they putting this much pressure on me to like go to a good school, like a name brand school? But I think in hindsight, it's something that they just want us to have a good future. And this is something that the Buddha or Prince Siddhartha realized really early on. That's why he excelled at everything that he did. Being like this awesome prince. So
yeah. And moving on though, from that time in his childhood, there were also other times in his childhood. These were times when he experienced he saw what the world was like. And some of these sights were very cruel. And so there were times when he would see birds eating worms that were freshly released after the plowing season. So all of the soil would be tilled and then worms would come out and then birds would come to eat them. And so he saw how vicious parts of life were and how it was sort of a really cutthroat environment out there.
It's really like survival of the fittest. And during that, according to the book written by Venerable Master, the Biography of Sakyamuni Buddha, I saw that he was kind of wondering why it had to be this way. There is this endless cycle of just competition and who survives, who wins, and who loses. And so him like observing that, it made him really uneasy and unsatisfied. And also going back to like the caste system, it was during an archery competition. I think he was viewing it with his father, and he saw that the Shudra, like the lowest caste, they had to be the servants and like they had to be working in the fields and sweating, while him and his father were just having a good time. And this inequality also was unsettling to him because he didn't think that this was normal. And I think that throughout our lives, we definitely like can see a lot of these things.
Oh yeah, I think looking back into my childhood, there were definitely times early on when I noticed inequalities. I noticed that, first of all, some kids would have things that I didn't have. For example, I had always really wanted a Game Boy Advance at the time, and that wasn't something I had until much, much later on. And it was just because of financial differences between families. But then there are other things like, oh, why does that person not necessarily have a lunch today? Or why does that person always bring lunch from home? And so there are things that, as a kid, I had noticed that there were differences amongst us students, but I didn't necessarily know the causes behind it, and I didn't know everything that led up to it. And so a lot of times I would just ignore it or not quite understand the full situation.
Right. I think when it's not concerning us, like it's easy to ignore. And also like adults will tell you like this is the way it is, like this is the status quo. So you shouldn't worry about these kinds of things like inequalities or like unfairness. But that wasn't the case in the case of the Buddha, because he just thought a lot about it, but he didn't necessarily like do something about it then. He just kept it in his mind. And then, you know, as he grew up into an adult, that's still in his mind. Like, it never went away. Mm-hmm. And that moves on, like, you know, moving on to his next stage in his life is when he is starting to take the throne.
So as he's growing up, his dad is the one that's shielding him from a lot of the negative parts of life. And so the Buddha grew up as a very sheltered kid. His father, the king, is giving him all of these wonderful palaces and all of these wonderful environments to grow up in. And so he's not really exposed to things like the death of close ones and things like that. And of course, the Buddha's mom actually passed away 7 days after the Buddha was born. But that was at a time when the Buddha was still an infant and likely didn't necessarily register what was going on. So his dad had protected him from a lot of these things. And I think for any parent, that's a very natural thing to do, whether or not you're a protective king. As a parent, you don't want your kids to necessarily see all of the terrible things that go on in the world. It's very instinctual for parents to cover their children or turn them away when a car accident happens, because that's not something that they want their children to see. And I think at this part, we can kind of understand where Siddhartha's father, King Suddhodana, is coming from and what his idea is.
Yeah, he saw his dissatisfaction, I guess, like, with, you know, the world around him. And the only way that King Suddhodana knew how to live his life was to be a king. So he was doing the best that he could to make sure that Siddhartha became the king that he will be in the future. So he wants him to follow in his footsteps because that's where he has experience. And while, like, his methods are kind of questionable, King Suddhodana basically, like, threw dancing girls at him, like, threw, like, temptations at him, made sure that he was never worrying about anything materialistically. It didn't ease the Buddha of his dissatisfaction, but it did create the illusion that everything is okay and the palace is a constant thing. Like, it'll always be this wonderful place that nothing bad ever happens in there.
But unfortunately, that's not always true. And so, yes, as he got older, there were times when he was finally allowed to leave the palace. And just as things would have it, each time he left the palace, he saw something different. And so there are 4 times when he left the palace. And on these 4 trips, he saw things like an old person. And upon seeing someone like that, which he had never really seen before, he would ask his chauffeur, well, chariot driver, but like the chauffeur at the time, and ask, what is going on here? Who is that? Why does the person have white hair? Why is his back all crooked? And why does he use a cane? And his chauffeur, his driver, would say to him, my prince, that's an old man. Your father is going to be like that one day. You are going to be like that one day. And upon hearing this, it was a complete shock to him. Because he had grown up in such a sheltered environment, it never really occurred to him that at one stage in his life, he would grow old and weak and decrepit, and everybody he loved would also go through the same thing. The same thing happened with a sick man. As he was pouring through the city, he encountered a sick man, and the same conversation happened. What is that? What's going on here? And then, that's a sick person. You're also going to end up like that someday. Your family is going to end up like that someday. Everybody you love is going to get sick at some point. And so he was shocked by that too. And then eventually death, coming across a dead body in a funeral and realizing that no matter what, everybody had to get old, get sick, and eventually pass away. But it's on his last trip, though, that is sort of the positive one, because he saw a wandering ascetic. And you can kind of think of this as like, I guess, a monk in a sense, someone who lives an ascetic lifestyle, sort of in the forest, meditates, does various spiritual practices, but not necessarily a Buddhist monk because Buddhist monks didn't exist at the time. But
Right.
I think we can, like, in our conception, we can think of it as something rather similar. And so he saw a monk, and he asked why this monk seemed so carefree and happy. And so the monk replied to him saying that he was on a spiritual journey and he was trying to find the end of suffering. And so Prince Siddhartha was really inspired.
Yeah, he definitely was. I think there was no one around him in his life that could do that for him, like offer him that other way out. Well, not a way out, but an alternate path of how his life could be. And I think upon seeing the 4 sides, or the first 3, he really realized that this world is impermanent. It's not going to be like partying all the time. And there is, in fact, people that are suffering and all of these things that are going on in the world. And that's what really, like you said, the inspiration that allowed him to really think about this path. And I think in our process of growing up, there's going to be something like that where there's going to be a big event that impacts your life where you think, oh, I'm definitely going to do this. Like, but it's keeping that motivation that is the hard part. So there are some challenges that ensued for him when he went to go talk to his father about this.
Definitely. And I think it's tying it back to like how I've been going through college right now. I think a lot of my experience has been sort of going through school, going through this normal average lifestyle, but then also thinking about these questions like, well, this still will happen. I'll still get old. I'll still be sick. I'll still pass away. And like all of this is sort of festering in my mind, of course. But then what I wanted to focus on is actually the role model part. And I think it's always very helpful to have that sort of inspiration and have that sort of role model. And to be honest, a lot of my role models are monastics. There are a lot of the venerables that I meet at the temple because they do so much and they're so happy doing what they do that I'm just really taken aback by that. And I'm really inspired and I admire them.
Yeah, for sure. Like the venerables at the temple, they don't get paid. They are working overtime all of the time. Yet they don't feel that, they don't look forward to the weekend because there is no weekend. They are always working, but it's for the betterment of the devotees, the people, and just Buddhism in general. So that is definitely something that a lot of my role models are venerables at the temple as well, because they work tirelessly for other people their whole life. So that's something that, Buddha's potentially, that's to us, like that's the equivalent of what he saw, and he was really inspired and he wanted to pursue that. And that he thought that was the ultimate way to, reaching happiness, but also happiness for other people.
And so as he's thinking, or as Prince Siddhartha is thinking of this after he's been inspired by this wandering ascetic, he decides, he's thinking about leaving the palace and becoming an ascetic himself. And so at this point, he goes up to his father, who's trying to get him to stay. And he asks his father if he can be granted, or at least guaranteed, that he won't die, that he won't get old, he won't get sick, and that all of his possessions would stay with him. And this wasn't something that his father, even as king, could guarantee. And upon realizing that, the prince says, well, then you can't really keep me here.
I think at this point in the story, like what I really saw is that like he realizes that his father can't do everything for him, and the Buddha, he decides like he's going to help himself, like he's going to change and he's going to like go on this path. And it's definitely not a path popular with the palace because they're losing an heir to the throne. And I think that sometimes like in the midst of like meeting our parents' expectations and like their wishes for us, we have to realize like what we're passionate about and really just go with it, or like go with what you're passionate about and not, like being limited by the parents because at the time, if you think about it, at Buddha's time, there wasn't a Buddha yet. Like there was no one to do that job for him, or there was no one that he could look to except for maybe the aesthetics in the society. So he had to go to pursue his dream, and he felt so strongly that he is going to leave everything behind and go find the ultimate truth.
Mm-hmm. And so upon deciding this, he ends up leaving his wife and newborn child to become an ascetic. And I think this part sounds really odd to a lot of people because it sounds like the Buddha is just having a midlife crisis and running away from home. But we have to really remind ourselves that this wasn't an easy choice for him. He didn't just drop everything and run. He really thought about this for a really, really long time and decided that it was the best decision for not just himself, but the people around him too, because he wanted to find a solution for all of them.
Mm-hmm. And I think being sheltered for so long, like being sheltered in the palace, really made him realize that this isn't the life that he wanted. The easier path would have been to stay in the palace and take over his responsibility, like what he thought his responsibility was when he was younger. But he decides to like revolutionize himself and go through with this crazy plan. What people thought of this plan as like a crazy plan. Like they didn't think that, how could you give up being a prince? And I'd like to remind everyone that this is like a place of privilege. Like it's good to be a prince. Like you'll live a good life. But, just his compassion towards others was so strong that he couldn't just leave them behind. Like he couldn't just not care about those things. So that's why he decided to do this, and not because he doesn't love his wife and his newborn son, but because he cares about all sentient beings. Like he has a compassionate heart towards all sentient beings. Therefore, he decided to make this very hard decision.
And yes, when he becomes an ascetic and when he goes off into the forest, he's going from being really, really high up in society, being a prince, to being a beggar. He doesn't know where his next meal is going to come from because it depends on whether or not the villagers give him anything the next day. And so he's really leaving a lot of his life behind.
And I feel like being from like that high of a status to lowering your status, it takes a lot of strength to lower your pride and beg for food, when before like his life was servants, like they come at a snap of a finger. And so I feel like that's also like an interesting parallel to in our lives when we are the babies of the house, but then when we go out into society, we are treated differently because not everything is about us anymore. So, I mean, I have siblings, so I'm not really like that sheltered, and like I'm not really like the baby of the house, but I know that Andrew is an only child, so like, would you mind sharing your experience with us?
Yes. Thank you for the jab at my only childness. Shout out to any only children who are listening to this. Because I definitely felt that. So I grew up as an only child, definitely spoiled, definitely got everything that I wanted. All of my cousins know this too.
Must be nice.
I know. All of my cousins are like, yeah, you're spoiled, which, yeah, I am. But then when I started volunteering at the temple, I wasn't special anymore. Like, I was put to do things that I never had to do around the house. And actually, one day, the Venerable asked me if I could help mow the lawn. And I looked at him, And he saw my face and he said, "Please don't tell me you've never mowed the lawn before." And I told him, "I'm sorry, but I've never mowed the lawn before." And he shook his head and he was like, "Well, I guess you're learning something new today."
Oh, wow.
Just
That's
like,
being
let me
thrown
show
into
you.
a whole new environment there.
But I think it was definitely very uncomfortable for me at first to go to a new place and completely be unfamiliar with the things that I was doing there. And all of the chores that I had to do around the temple, all of the positions I was put in at the temple. And then I do feel like it was really helpful for me though, because it built me up to who I am today. And I think myself, this is true to a very small extent, but to the Buddha, as he was going through his ascetic practice, he was letting go of all of these habits that he had accumulated as a prince and all of the expectations that he had as a prince, and just letting go of all of these one by one by one. And as he's doing so, he's also learning from a lot of teachers, learning things like meditation and a lot of the other spiritual practices at the time.
Right. And that requires really strong mental power. You really need to be strong. Well, it's hard. Ascetic practice is really hard on the body because at the time he was eating 1 grain of rice per day, and you also had to be strong mentally so that you wouldn't collapse. And that kind of reminds me of athletes. So the Winter Olympics was recently in February, and a lot of these athletes, when they share their story, they talk about the training that they have to go through and the discipline and the training. And I kind of question what is this all for? But it's for that one day they can earn a medal. And this is the kind of strength that is comparable, but I feel is really just I can't even imagine, because I don't live in a place where I'm there's a food scarcity or anything. So, that part of the story really inspires me, because the easier way out would be just return to the palace and tell his dad, yeah, you were right. This is really hard. But he pulled through, and eventually, spoiler alert, he realizes that this is not the right way. He realizes that the middle way is actually the ultimate path to liberation. It's just that this is a necessary part for him to become who he is today.
Yeah. So at this point, when he realizes that he's not going to become awakened through self-starvation and essentially self-torture, he decides to accept an offering of rice porridge from a local shepherd girl. And in doing so, he starts eating again, he starts bathing, he starts regaining his energy, and lives a very moderate lifestyle. And I think at this stage really shows the importance of being able to accept someone's help, too.
Sometimes, I feel we get tunnel vision, when you're trying to do something, achieving a goal, per se. You're trying to say oh, I did this all by myself, and I want to achieve this, I want to achieve that. But this was, in Buddha's case, this was at a time where he had no physical strength, and he really did have to accept that porridge. But it doesn't mean that he's any less than the person who is offering it to him, because without Buddha accepting the porridge, the shepherd girl could not have offered this porridge to the Buddha to be. So they're equal in that case. And I think that accepting someone's help is not a bad thing. It's just it helps us realize that we're all relying on each other for things to be done. And it's not something that we should turn away from. It's okay to rely on other people and not be self-reliant all of the time.
If we were self-reliant, this podcast wouldn't exist. And I think that's a very good example of that. All of the things that go into this podcast, all of the things that keep it going, we don't live in a vacuum. So after accepting the offering, we slowly move to the climax of the story. And the Buddha, having now regained his energy, sits down under the Bodhi tree and starts to meditate. And as he's doing so, Mara, which is often translated as like the demon, which is essentially sort of a personification of his inner fears, his doubts, and all of these things coming out, starts to attack him. And so Mara starts by offering lots of rewards, like think of all the power that you'll have if you just leave and go back. Think of all the wealth and all of the companionship. All of these people are waiting for you at the palace and you'll live so happily. But the Buddha looks at all of these and thinks they're not permanent anyway. And so those fade away. And then he gets hit with a bunch of threats like, oh, if you don't leave, I'm going to kill you. I'm going to do this. I'm going to hurt you and all these things and all of these fears. But the Buddha also is not moved. And I think this really reminds me of a situation in a really sort of high stress situation where we have a lot of self-doubt and we think like, oh, I should just quit. I shouldn't be here. I shouldn't be here. And for me, a lot of times this is usually during like an exam, during a test, or even during like a performance where I'm just so terrified and I'm creating my own stress. I'm creating my own fear at that point.
Yeah, we put a lot of mental walls up because in our perception, like we don't think that, you know, this is going to be done. Like we put a lot of like stress on ourselves. And I think that those fears are really just based on like our attachment to the result and our attachment to like, you know, are other people going to like this or whatever, or am I going to do well? But in the long run, and it's also very short-sighted. So I guess my point is like Buddha saw through this because he saw like in the long run, like in the really big picture, these things don't matter anyway. So like that's how he was able to conquer, and that's how he was like not fazed by all of these things, because obviously these temptations, like it's tempting, but he sees that this is only right now. It's only for a short amount of time, but he could change his perspective and realize that, you know, in the big picture, reaching enlightenment is his goal, and he's not going to let these inner fears stop him.
And so I think this is also, there's another aspect that I think a lot of people can relate to, and that's the point where all of these fears fall away. And for me, this is the other part of the test when once I get into the test, once I start filling in bubbles or writing in the answers and things are coming to me, I get to a state of focus where I'm only focusing on the test. I'm going to answer the questions. I'm going to do all of this and I'm going to finish it. And once I switch my attention to that, all of these fears sort of drown themselves out and they become part of the background noise. And I work through it and I conquer this test. I'm done. I turn it in. And hopefully I'll do the same thing tomorrow when I do my final. And then I'll just... Final season is rough.
It is definitely... Like that week, I think my eye bags like went like 3 shades darker. It's so bad. As you were talking about that though, I was thinking about like, okay, so let's use this final exam as an example, right? I feel like the Buddha like did his homework, like he did his studying. So like all of that, like the ascetic practice, you know, the meditation, he did his studying before the test. So when the test comes, like there's that initial like anxiety, but he's not afraid when it comes. But, you know, I don't study. So like sometimes when I just get the test, I freak out and it's just, there's nothing I could do like if you do badly on it. So I think like the Buddha story is also a story of diligence and perseverance. Like you really have to keep your initial mind and make sure that all of your conditions are right for your success. So it is all in your control. It's not because the test is too hard. It's not because the professor's unfair. You really do gotta do, you really gotta do your own homework.
And it's something that I think is very similar to Buddhism in that no one can do it for you. No one can study for you. No one can prepare for this for you. You have to do that work yourself. And it really pays off in the long run because once you do put in all of that effort, it shows on the exam, it shows in that final paper, and you're able to succeed when the time comes.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so
We've hit his enlightenment or his awakening.
Yeah. This is actually going to be a 2-part like mini series. So next episode we'll talk about, how he taught and his life after enlightenment.
Yeah. And so before we close for the day, I just wanted to say thank you to all of our fans. We hit 101 likes within a week of this podcast being released. I am so grateful for all of the warm support that has come from all of you.
Thank you so much. I was really surprised, and I know some of my friends are listening, and I just can't thank everyone enough for the support. Again, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to email us or leave us a message on our Facebook page. We really appreciate it.
And again, this is Buddhapod.
I'm Catherine.
And I'm Andrew. See you next week.
Bye.